Nice Halloween costume, Grandpa. A young man laughed loudly as the old man entered the courtroom, wearing a faded uniform and worn-out shoes. All eyes turned. Some people snickered. Others looked at him as if he was lost. But then, as he approached the bench, the judge himself stood up and formally saluted. The courtroom fell silent. Type respect. If you believe those who serve their country deserve to be honored, not mocked. Harold Hal Jensen, 79, was a former Marine Corps lieutenant colonel who had served in Vietnam, Panama, and as a tactical advisor in the Middle East during the 90s. After discharge, he lived simply, never boasting, working as a welder until retirement. One day, he received a summons to court as a witness in a land dispute involving veterans. He decided to wear the last uniform he had kept from his homecoming. Though old, he had hand-washed and ironed it flat all night. On his way to court, he had to take 2 bus routes, then walk nearly a mile because he didn't have a car. When he entered the courtroom, a group of young people chuckled, whispering, "Old soldier looks like an extra in a movie." An older woman moved her seat away when he sat down in the gallery, but he didn't notice. He held his kepi cap as if it were part of his own body. When the clerk called his name, he stood up, his back still straight, though his legs trembled slightly. He walked to the stand, each step carrying the same dignity as when he once marched onto battlefields. The small county courthouse was crowded that morning. A property dispute between a veterans organization and a developer had drawn an unusual mix of citizens, retirees concerned about community space, young professionals interested in new housing, and a handful of veterans who had come to support their cause. Hal had been reluctant to get involved, preferring his quiet life tending to his small garden and occasionally visiting the VFW hall. But when the veterans group mentioned that the land in question had once been promised as a memorial site for fallen servicemen, he couldn't refuse their request to testify about the original agreement he had witnessed decades ago. The night before, he had opened the cedar chest that contained his few military possessions. The uniform inside, carefully preserved in plastic, hadn't been worn since his last official ceremony before retirement. The medals, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart among them, were arranged precisely on the left breast. He had spent hours polishing each brass button until they gleamed against the faded fabric. His arthritis made buttoning the jacket difficult, and the waist was a bit tighter than he remembered. But when he finally stood before the mirror at dawn, the transformation was remarkable. His shoulders, normally curved with age, straightened instinctively, his chin lifted. For a moment, he was not a 79-year-old retiree, but once again, Lieutenant Colonel Jensen, whose orders had been followed without question, whose decisions had saved countless lives. The journey to the courthouse had been harder than anticipated. The first bus was late, forcing him to run, as well as his aged knees would allow, to catch the connection. A light rain had begun to fall, and he covered his cap with his handkerchief, more concerned about preserving the emblem than keeping himself dry. By the time he entered the courthouse, navigating through security in the crowded hallways, small beads of sweat mixed with raindrops on his forehead. Yet he maintained his composure, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. "Probably confused about what day it is," someone murmured as he passed. "Is there a parade I didn't hear about?" another asked with a snicker. Hal heard them all, of course. His hearing was one of the few things age hadn't diminished, but he had endured far worse than mockery in his life, and these comments slid off him like the raindrops from his shoulders. What mattered was his promise to speak the truth today. One more mission, perhaps his last. The moment Hal passed the first row of benches, Judge Andrew Carlisle suddenly paused. He removed his glasses, studying the faded uniform carefully, then his gaze fixed on a small detail. A chest pin shaped like an eagle with a broken wing, a top-secret symbol reserved only for commanders of POW, prisoners of war, rescue units. Unexpectedly, Judge Carlisle rose to his feet, placed his hand over his heart, then raised his hand in a military salute. The entire courtroom froze. No one understood what was happening. Hal nodded slightly, not returning the salute, but maintained his formal posture all the way to the witness stand. Carlisle spoke gravely. "Lieutenant Colonel Jensen, it's an honor to meet you. I was a sergeant in the 3rd Brigade, And I'm alive today because of someone from the rescue unit at Ashura Pass in 1972. Hal blinked. You? Andrew? Yes, Lieutenant Colonel. You pulled me out of that trench that day. I never had the chance to thank you. A small round of applause broke out from the back, coming from veterans attending the hearing. The attorney stood up. One whispered, "He's a legend. I've heard the name but thought he was dead." The land dispute was resolved quickly, partly because the witness was so credible, partly because no one dared view him as just an ordinary old man anymore. But Hal didn't care about winning or losing. He simply said, "I came because a young soldier was being forced off ancestral land. I once swore never to leave anyone behind." Judge Carlisle's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his robes. The courtroom, typically a place of controlled emotions and procedural formality, had suddenly become charged with unexpected recognition and remembered debt. The defense attorney, momentarily thrown by the exchange, recovered his composure. "Your Honor, while I respect the witness's service, I must object to any personal connection influencing these proceedings." "Objection noted," Carlisle replied, his voice steady again. "This court will maintain its impartiality. However, showing respect for a decorated officer is not a breach of protocol." Hal stood at the witness stand, his weathered hands resting lightly on the rail. The oath he had just taken to tell the truth seemed almost redundant for a man who had lived his entire life by a code of honor far more demanding than any courtroom could impose. When questioned about the land dispute, Hal spoke with clear, precise recollection. He described the meeting in 1994 where county officials had promised the parcel would remain dedicated to veteran services, producing from his breast pocket a yellowed but meticulously preserved copy of the original minutes. "These signatures," he said, indicating the document, "represent a commitment made to men and women who served. In my experience, commitments matter." The developer's attorney approached cautiously for cross-examination. "Colonel Jensen, with all due respect to your service, this document isn't legally binding. Times change. Needs change." Hal looked at him steadily. "Yes, they do. But principles shouldn't. When we tell people we'll do something, especially those who have sacrificed, we should follow through." Throughout his testimony, the atmosphere in the courtroom continued to shift. The young people who had laughed earlier now sat in uncomfortable silence. The woman who had moved away studied her hands in her lap, not meeting anyone's eyes. As Hal stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Carlisle spoke quietly. "The court thanks you for your testimony, Colonel. And if I may add personally, thank you for Ashura Pass." A veteran in the back row stood up and called, "Iron Eagle," using Hal's old call sign. Two others joined him, standing at attention. "This is when I saw myself, a young citizen, no longer permitted to look away, because if someone who had taken bullets could still step up to do what's right, then what could I do at minimum? Type duty if you think there are people who keep their oath their entire lives without needing reminders." After the hearing, Judge Carlisle personally escorted Hal to the door. The press wasn't invited, but a law student captured the moment Carlisle stood at attention and saluted a second time. The video spread quickly with the title, "Judge Salutes Old Man in Court, Then Reveals Truth That Silenced the Room." Veteran forums nationwide shared photos of Hal, some people confirming they had fought alongside him. One wrote, "He didn't just save me from gunfire, he sent a handwritten letter to my mother. I keep that letter to this day." A Marine Corps representative contacted Hal, inviting him to speak at the National Memorial Service. He declined. "I just want to go home, grow tomatoes, and remember the names of those who didn't return." But Carlisle wouldn't let him fade away quietly like that. A week later, the local city hall organized a surprise ceremony. No spotlights, no media. Only about 30 people attended, mostly veterans, families of young soldiers, and high school students. On the platform, Carlisle said, "Mr. Hal once said, soldiers don't ask to be remembered, but if others see what's right, they will remember for us. Today, we remember for him." Students from the law class presented him with a new cap embroidered with "Still Serving." Just quieter. Hal accepted it, but wore his old cap home. "This one has absorbed blood. I wear it to never forget who walked beside me." The video had been captured by Melissa Chen. a second-year law student who recognized the significance of what she was witnessing. Her post, initially shared just with friends, was picked up by a veteran's social media account with millions of followers. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 10 million times. Comments poured in from across the country and around the world. This is what respect looks like. Find someone who looks at you the way that Judge looks at the colonel. I'm not crying, you're crying. But the most meaningful responses came from other veterans, particularly those who had served under Hal's command or benefited from operations he had led. I was a radio man in his unit in '68. The colonel would check everyone's equipment himself before missions. Said he wouldn't send anyone out with gear he wouldn't trust his own life to. Jensen pulled my father out of a POW camp in '73. Dad never talked about it, but he kept a photo of the colonel in his wallet until the day he died. What the viral video didn't capture was the conversation that followed the hearing. Judge Carlisle had invited Hal to his chambers, where the two men spoke privately for nearly an hour. "You don't remember me specifically, do you?" Carlisle had asked once they were seated. Hal studied him. "The face, yes, but there were so many that day." Carlisle nodded. 17 of us. You carried 2 men on your back, directed the choppers under fire, and came back 3 times when you could have evacuated with the first group." "We all did what was necessary," Hal replied simply. "You know why I became a judge?" Carlisle asked. "Because after Ashura, I promised myself if I survived, I'd spend my life ensuring others received justice. It seemed a poor repayment for my life, but it was what I could offer." The ceremony at City Hall wasn't grand by any standard. The mayor was traveling, the council chamber modest, the refreshments limited to coffee and store-bought cookies. But its simplicity suited Hal perfectly. Local veterans, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall despite their years, formed an informal honor guard. High school history students, brought by their teacher to witness living history, listened with uncommon attention as Carlisle recounted how Hal's unit had specialized in extracting trapped soldiers from seemingly impossible situations. Before there were movie rescue heroes, Carlisle explained, there were real ones, and they didn't have special effects or second takes. When it was Hal's turn to speak, he kept it brief. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't get to come home and grow old. I just did what they would have done if our positions had been reversed." His voice grew softer. "Remember them. They're the ones who deserve ceremonies." A month later, the first seat in the courtroom where Hal had sat received a small bronze plaque, "Reserved for those who have served and still keep their oath." From then on, any veteran appearing in court was invited to sit in the front row. Hal continued his simple life, but every Sunday morning, dozens of cards arrived at his home. "You once saved my father. You're the reason I chose to join the Marines. Thank you for standing up, not on the battlefield, but in the place of law." One day, when Carlisle was asked, "What made you stand up during the proceedings?" he answered, "Someone once took bullets for me. That day I just stood to repay the debt." The bronze plaque became a courthouse tradition. Visitors would often touch it for luck or take photos beside it. Court officers ensured it was polished daily. In the years that followed, Hal rarely ventured far from his small home. His garden expanded to include not just tomatoes, but a variety of vegetables that he regularly shared with neighbors. He never spoke of his service unless directly asked, and even then, his accounts were brief and focused on his comrades rather than himself. Judge Carlisle, however, had been profoundly changed by the reconnection. He established a veterans justice program in the county, ensuring that former service members had access to legal resources and understanding when they appeared in his court. Cases involving veterans received special consideration for their unique circumstances, particularly those suffering from PTSD or adjustment difficulties. The two men met occasionally for coffee at a small diner near the courthouse. Their conversations were quiet, often consisting more of comfortable silence than words. They understood each other in ways that required no elaboration. When Hal passed away 3 years later, his funeral was attended by hundreds, many of whom he had never met, but whose lives he had touched, directly or indirectly, through his service and example. Judge Carlisle delivered the eulogy, ending with words that would later be added to the courthouse plaque. "Some uniforms may fade, But honor never does. Some uniforms are no longer new, but each fold represents a battle line, and each step they take is a reminder we live because they once stood in our place. Subscribe to TT Hero Stories if you believe sacrifice doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be remembered properly. TT Hero Stories, because some heroes never stop serving.